So let's talk about the strongest and weakest technological marvels that the Tau Empire has to throw at the enemy, with an overview of every single unit in the Codex and the pros and cons of fielding each. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tau, so prepare to talk Fire Warriors and Battle Suits with an overview of the Codex in full. Currently power-wise, I'd say that the Tau Empire army is in a pretty good place. At tournaments, their win rate is kind of middling, fairly middle of the road, but they do seem to be one of the armies that pro players get a lot of good success with. Lots of big grand tournament wins, which kind of implies that they're an army that you can go really far with. Once you've mastered them, they get very, very strong. Despite that though, I would say that their internal balance isn't super great right now. A lot of competitive lists do tend to default to a few standard choices, and maybe quite a bit of the rest just seems a little bit underwhelming by comparison. In this video I thought we'd take each unit in turn, talk about the pros and cons of fielding them in game, plus a rough strength rating, at least in my opinion, for how they stand at the moment. Loads to talk about, so let's jump in and start with the troops. So first up we have the Fire Warrior Strike Team, our standard grey-skinned hoofed aliens with pulse rifles. They're 80 points for 10 of them, and do have a fair bit going for them, including being a troop slot and getting objectives secured. Troops are pretty relevant in Tau armies, as a fair few lists seem to like fielding multiple patrols to get more commanders in. The Strike Team are armed with their AP-1 pulse rifles and do pack a bit of a threat against most light infantry. On paper they really are quite a solid choice for home field objectives, a decent range which means they can still chip in to help out the battle if they need to, and are at least somewhat annoying to remove as they do have a 4+ save which gets quite nice in cover. They really aren't lacking for support options either. Fireblades are quite efficient if you want to increase their power, and they've got good stratagems and lots of other options you can take in the squads, including that turret, but at least compared with the other troops they do have some issues. Maybe despite having really good damage buffs available, they're just a bit of a small unit just by their very nature, and it means that a lot of the supporting things that you might buy for them or spend stratagems on tend to be just a tiny bit underwhelming compared with spending points on buffing things like battle suits. In general, it does seem that the vast majority of Tau Empire lists tend to take cheap recruit for 60 points for a unit to do troops things just a bit better, and if you want a punch that's coming out of a devilfish, you may as well make it breachers, as the devilfish will get them there and make their close range not such a bad thing. Their pulse rifles are only really so good if they have things like light infantry to shoot against. In the era of Armour of Contempt, they just can't really be relied on to be your mainline damage dealers. And also they definitely got hurt a bit by being forced to take a 10-man squad of them. It means that you can't take small little squads for objectives, you have to pay for a big 10 of them. Between all that, it just means that strike teams very rarely seem to appear in competitive Tau lists these days. Recruit and breachers seem to get the nods more often, and overall I'd rank these guys a 6 out of 10. Realistically though, I don't think that they're completely unusable. You could certainly justify a unit or two for holding backfield objectives. Perhaps the most honed lists just tend to trim a bit of the extra investment on them though. Moving on to their counterparts with the Pulse Blasters, the Breach team at 85 points for 10 models, a pretty similar stat line to the Strike team, but with a much more deadly close range punch if you can get them there with their Strength 6 AP-2 Pulse Blasters. As I just mentioned, they are very easy to deliver out of a Devilfish where you can move and then disembark with a stratagem, and when they get there you can also use a 1 CP stratagem to allow them to reroll all wound rolls, making those Pulse Blasters pretty much efficient against most things. On paper they're really just not such a hard unit to just scoot onto objectives and then proceed to shoot the enemy infantry very hard when they get there. Again, in terms of the most optimised competitive lists though, Breacher teams only seem to make their way into a few of them. I feel like they're usable but not so great they're auto-include, perhaps because partly after they have delivered their initial blast, they're perhaps just not quite sturdy enough to reliably survive on the front lines against the enemy counter-attack. The fact that they do need a Devilfish to deliver them as well does mean that you're investing more into the unit. They kind of need the support, otherwise they're likely going to just get killed before they get in effective range. Still though, really quite usable, I'd rate them an 8 out of 10 overall. Finally, and for the most common competitive troops choice, we have the Kroot Carnivores, 6 points per model, and the Auxiliary Birdmen are a very tempting choice in the troops section, seeing as they fill detachments for less and still basically do the good troops job of getting you 10 bodies on objectives. Their raw stats really aren't too bad as well for just 6-point models. For the cost they really are quite brutal against light infantry at close range, a reasonable shooting attack followed up by AP-1 melee, and they've got a nice pre-game move as well so they can function as cheap expendable screens early game for the Tau. If you did want to go mad with them, maybe you could think about using Delith Sept and some Ethereals to support them. Their damage can get a bit better that way, though most of the time I'd be tempted just to run them as cheap units and save big points investments for other things. They do have their issues. If they're out in the open, they have really quite a poor save and are very easy to remove. Even when they're in cover, that only just about gets them up to a 4+ save, so it's still not outstanding. They're not really going to be very good damage dealers against anything but light infantry, and in general, if you want a very cheap expendable screening unit, then the Hounds might do that a bit better at only 24 points for a unit. Still though, they are a very solid troops choice. I'd rank them a 9 out of 10 overall, an easy unit of choice to fill out detachments. While we're on the troops, I thought I might mention the Devilfish as well, seeing as this transports the breaches. It's a 95-point transport unit, which means that you can get those dangerous pulse blasters into range quite easily with the move and disembark stratagem in your tactical philosophy. On top of that, it's got a little bit of anti-light infantry fire with that accelerated burst cannon plus a couple of gun drones, and you could upgrade those to smart missile systems if desired. After it's delivered its cargo, it can be a somewhat durable sacrificial unit to park on objectives and give your opponent something to deal with. And I quite like the way that you get a different bonus depending on your tactical philosophy, a big pre-game move with Montcar to get the units where they need to be, or go into strategic reserve if it needs to with Cao Yon. As for downsides, it doesn't have that much damage for the cost, and as a transport vehicle it is kind of dependent on breaches being good for this to be good. If they weren't, then it would be completely irrelevant. I'd say that breaches are basically usable but not super strong, so I'd pretty much rank this in the same place. Overall I've given it an 8 out of 10, a solid enough delivery system for pulse blasters. Moving on to elites next, we have some of the core of the Codex in the Crisis battlesuits, 40 points per model each before their guns, and pretty much at the moment in Codex Tau Empire they are the core unit that you need to build around, as the other core units like Pathfinders, Stealth Teams and Fire Warriors just really aren't quite on the same sort of level damage wise. Now Broadside's Lost Core, they really are the unit that you want to focus as many buffs on as possible, and they get pretty scary when you do. They've got solid stratagems, including being able to jump, shoot, jump and various damage things. Ethereals can give them a feel no pain, Commanders can give them all sorts of different buffs that we'll get onto, and they also make great use of things like the Exemplar of Montcar Warlord trait. The firepower that you can load onto them really is very flexible. There's lots of different viable loadouts for them, and I'd argue that literally every single one of their guns can have its place in the right build, though perhaps some are a bit more workhorse staples than other ones. You are likely to see a fair few plasma rifles and cyclic ion blasters around. Then the unit has a whole load of support things that you can take within the squad, hidden drones like shield drones to tank wounds, or markers to have a safe source of marker lights if you're not moving around too fast. They are very mobile with a 10-inch move and they can easily advance, particularly in Montcar or with a Tau Commander around. They do have that stratagem to move extra quickly up the board as well. They can jump, shoot, jump with a stratagem, so a big scary unit could jump out of the way and get behind cover after they've shot, basically guaranteeing that they get to strike again next turn. They can deep strike as needed, maybe that's a bit more tempting for smaller units, but really quite nice with that drop acquisition stratagem, either in the regular one or the Farsight Enclaves version. And even if the enemy does manage to tag them in combat, after no doubt wading through some powerful overwatch, they can also shoot there if they want, so getting tagged in combat isn't the end of the world. Prior to Games Workshop's points increases, they were perhaps one of the strongest units in the entire game of 40k. They've certainly been reined in a fair bit since then, going up in points quite so much, but still remain a staple in just about every Tau list. For downsides, being such a staple unit that if you are building around them in a big way, you really can't afford to get them killed too early. The toughness for the cost is okay, particularly with drones, though still for the amount of points that you might often be spending on them, it's not exactly standout if the enemy gets to deal some full damage dealing to them. Still though, pretty much a staple of just about every Tau list. Maybe that's not the worst thing in the world though, for perhaps their most iconic battle line unit. I've given them the full 10 out of 10. They're just very threatening with buffs, and they have all sorts of good ways to build them. Moving on, we have their cousins in the elite slot, the Crisis Bodyguards. They pay 5 points more per model for some slight side grades and different choices. The most obvious benefit is that they get the bodyguard rule that helps them shield characters, though that was reined in quite a bit in a previous balanced data slate. Otherwise though, they do have some other advantages. They can be fielded slot free provided you've got a commander around, which you usually will have. You can take them in smaller units of 2 if you'd like to, and if you did manage to max out your crisis suit allowance, these guys could allow you to basically field more and get around the rule of 3. I'd say those things though are only kind of worth it for a 5-point premium. For the vast majority of lists, I think you're usually going to want the crisis suits first, and only field these guys if they're a fallback option that makes more sense given the list and detachments. They do also come with 1 less hard point for weapons and support systems as well, so maybe you're a little bit harder to build big with. Still though, they do the vast majority of things that crisis suits do, with a couple of interesting other options. A secondary choice to the crisis suit, but still really quite a relevant one. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10 overall. Moving on to more battlesuit goodness in the elite slot, we have the stealth suits. 25 points per model at base, and they can forward deploy with a bunch of burst cannon shots to threaten infantry. Deploying up the board can help Tau with board control, and maybe give things like crew units space to pre-game move into if the opponent also has their own infiltrators and things. And they do have a few other advantages going for their unit, allowing a first turn crisis suit alpha strike with their beacon action if they need to, and re-entering reserves with a stratagem. Their stealth generators do make them somewhat annoying to remove, and they do have the core keyword as well, both of which are good things. Perhaps their biggest downside is they just have really quite weak damage output, not really worth investing heavy buffs in the unit, and even with those stealth fields, the defense of them is kind of okay but not standout for a unit that you're likely going to be deploying up the board. At best, I think you'd only want 1 or 2 units in a list, and it does look like the majority of optimized armies tend to be passing them up at the moment. Perhaps for screening and board control, it's just better off to get some squads of Crude Hounds or something, a very cheap unit that can get into the midfield with their pre-game move, and then just hide rather than trying to engage the enemy like these guys would with their burst cannons. Overall, I'd rate them a 7 out of 10, pretty usable and can be interesting for that beacon, perhaps not super standout though. Next up, we've got the Stealth Suit's bigger brother in the Ghost Kill, an elite choice for 160 points per model base, and I must admit this one has just felt a little bit overcosted since the Codex dropped. The damage output just really doesn't compare well with a lot of other Tau options. On the plus side though, it can be pretty annoying to kill. The stealth fields help, plus the drones make it untargetable greater than 18 inches away unless it's closest, so in theory it could be a good one for standing on a home field or far-flung outlying objective. It can be made even tankier as well by taking a Feel No Pain type upgrade, which can help deflect some of the strongest fire. You can equip it with some fusion weapons to make it fairly threatening at close range with flamers and the fusion collider, and like the stealth suits it gets to forward deploy, meaning that it should be in a good position to engage the enemy right away. It does have that stratagem to return to reserves as well, similar to the stealth suits. On the downsides though, I feel like the Ghost Kill is a unit that maybe could have used core. I feel that its damage output just isn't really all that great for the cost, and maybe it would have been one of the units that wouldn't have been terrible for Games Workshop to give it. Either that, or I think it just needs to get reduced in cost by a fair few points, maybe somewhere around the 10 to 20 point mark. For the unit itself, I'd say that maybe the forward deployment and long range protection rules perhaps conflict a bit. You have the ability to be a lot closer to the enemy, but the range protection makes that you want to be a little bit further away. Overall, I'd say it's not unusable, but just really quite underwhelming compared with other choices. Being generous, I've given it a 6 here. It might have been a 5 though. Next we have the Crutox Rider, a 25 point elite's choice, with a great big Crutox with a Crute with a gun on the back, and it can be one that can be fielded as a very cheap unit as well at 25 points. Like the other Crute, it has a pre-game move and actually a bit more damage to speak of. It does have some damage to melee, plus the autocannon like Crute gun. You can field them slot free if you take a Carnivore squad, and the toughness for the cost isn't awful either. In general though, while its stats really aren't too bad, it is really competing with faster Crute Hounds for a similar kind of role, a unit that can jump up the board a bit quicker and just be kind of annoying to remove and give you board control. Perhaps being a fair bit slower and also having the cavalry keyword so it needs to go around terrain both don't help it to that regard, and even being a little bit tougher and a bit more threatening just don't seem to win it the battle over the hounds. Unfortunately, they also just don't seem to be quite good enough to carry themselves as raw damage dealers either, getting outcompeted by other options. Overall, I've ranked them a 6 out of 10. Having cheap units that actually do have a bit of threat to them I think really isn't the worst in the world. 1 or 2 I think is unlikely to harm a list that much, but it seems that hounds get the nod for most people more than the Crutoxes. Next up, we've got the Farsight Marksman, an elite's choice for 70 points per unit. It comes with a marksman with a marker light, plus 3 drones with their long shot pulse rifles, provides a little bit of sniper fire, and also can potentially camp on home objectives quite well, as they have a stealth field that prevents them from being shot at long distances. Theoretically, that could be useful enough to camp on a home field objective, though to be honest I think that troops still are likely going to be a better shout. They remain a bit more resistant to close range shooting or melee if it catches up with them, plus have objectives secured and these guys don't. Beyond that, the sniper damage that they offer is just kind of bad really. It's okay against characters, though certainly not standout for the cost, and certainly pretty inefficient against just about anything else. Overall I feel like these guys just stack up to be kind of underwhelming. 70 points is quite a lot for what you're getting here, and I'd rank them a 5 out of 10. Next up, and perhaps one of the more underwhelming units with the Tau Codex, are the new Crute Farstalkers. Basically the kill team upgrade kits with a bunch of special weapons for them, 80 points per unit, and unfortunately they just pretty much feel directly worse than the Troops Choice Crute units. You pay 20 points more than the standard Crute for these guys, and all they really get you is a couple of free special weapons, plus a bounty type special rule where you get to reroll ones against one chosen unit. Even if these guys were the exact same price as regular Kroot units, I still don't think they'd really be taken. They don't get objectives secured when the carnivores do, and they don't fill out the battalion or patrol detachments which you generally want them to. Being more expensive than regular Kroots for a unit that's generally going to be quite good for being expendable screens just really isn't a good thing either. Overall, I feel like they may be one of the most underwhelming units in the Codex at the moment. I've ranked them a 3 out of 10. Maybe not absolutely unusable, but it just feels like they're completely directly outclassed by standard Kroot. Unfortunately, I just feel that these guys are spending an extra 20 points over the troops unit for pretty much no gain whatsoever. Sure, you get some special weapons, but losing Obsec in the troop slot outweigh that in my opinion. Staying with Kroot though, and on the more positive side of things, are the Kroot Hounds. These bird dogs are both very cheap at 6 points and also really quite fast, moving 12 inches and getting their pre-game move like the other Kroots, and are available in very nice small units as well. You can take just 4 of them, really nice for jumping onto an objective and forcing your opponent to have to deal with them. They can put in a little bit of damage work against infantry and things, though generally that's not going to be their main purpose. They're just pretty excellent for throwing onto objectives, forcing your opponent to deal with them with something more important, maybe then exposing that unit to the counter-attack. The small unit profile is also pretty easy to hide in terrain, and they can be slot-free with the Kroot carnivores if you need them to be. As for negatives, they're never really going to do all that much on the damage front, maybe eat a light infantry or 2 if they get lucky, and they will be really quite easy to gun down if they are exposed and the enemy gets small arms to bear on them. Overall though, I think it's hard to go too far wrong with a fast moving unit for 24 points that can do a little damage. I'd rate them a 9 out of 10 overall. I feel like a unit or 2 of these is rarely going to be a bad idea. Next up we've got the Piranhas, 60 points per model, and a fairly cheap harassment fast attack unit with an accelerated burst cannon and some gun drones. Perhaps their biggest advantage is their speed. They do move very quickly at 16 inches, and 7 wounds at toughness 4 isn't awful for such a fast unit either. If you did want to try and make any strategy work with disembarking gun drones or using seeker missiles, and they're a pretty reasonable squad to try and do that with as well, you're going to get more value out of disembarking drones for the stratagem on these guys if you did spam a whole bunch of them, rather than say on just one hammerhead tank or something. They can also outflank if you want them to, though I think generally you probably wouldn't want to, just as they've got great movement on the board anyway. The big caveat to all that is their damage output is just kind of underwhelming. Neither the Fusion Blaster or the Burst Cannon is particularly exciting, and Tau just really aren't too short of threats that can move kind of fast and also hit very hard. Standard Crisis Suits, Hammerheads and the Sunshark Bomber all can move at least reasonably fast if they need to, and put out much stronger damage than Piranhas can. Overall they just feel very niche indeed. I'd rank them a 6 out of 10 overall. They definitely pay a premium for that big movement characteristic. Next up we've got the Pathfinders, 90 points for a unit that's locked to a squad size of 10, and perhaps most likely to be employed for mass marker lights, as you do get an awful lot of marker shots in the same unit for this amount of cost. Theoretically they could be fairly interesting from a damage perspective. If you do upgrade them with special weapons they are reasonably efficient damage per point, but perhaps the main issue with that is just that they're really quite fragile. Per point they're already fragile at 90 points, never mind if you go upgrading them with all sorts of fancy gear on top of that. They might have a good round of shooting but get removed fairly easily unless you're using their stratagem to move, shoot, move for command points. They can pre-game move as well to get into the middle of the board, but again as they're so easy to take out, you'd really want to do so while making sure that they're safe from enemy reprisals. In general it just seems that the majority of people tend to prefer their marker lights attached to characters or buried in big units of suits. I feel like the Pathfinders maybe aren't unusable with their move shoot move option, but currently with how easy they are to kill, just maybe not one of the top tier Tau units. I've ranked them a 7 out of 10 overall. Next up we've got the Tactical Drones, a fast attack unit where you can spam a whole bunch of them if you want to, 10 points for either a gun drone or a marker drone. I feel like they might perhaps be most interesting for an independent marker light squad. You could get 4 marker drones for just 40 points, and that's a unit that isn't really too a big deal if the enemy decides to take them out. You can have a squad of them for less investment than Pathfinders. They're a tiny bit tougher per model, and also they can move quite far. Otherwise, at least theoretically, you could be getting quite a lot of pull shots out of gun drones. If you have them next to a drone controller, then a unit of them could easily be putting out 40 odd pull shots hitting on Thors, which isn't the worst thing. They do have to target the closest unit to them though, which could make positioning them just a tiny bit annoying. Otherwise, for downsides of the units, drones just have a fair few disadvantages that most other units don't. The core rules aren't enormously kind to them, as basically just being artificial bits of war gear for the Tau rather than actual units. Plus I feel that the tactical drone squad maybe went up in points a bit needlessly. I feel like they just caught some flack from Games Workshop nerfing drones in other units, which was perhaps more the thing that they wanted to hit. Overall I'd rank them a 6 out of 10, again not completely unusable, with either damage spam or small marker squads, but generally I feel you're going to be better with other units for those roles. Next up we've got the Vespid Stingwings, 12 points per model with alien auxiliaries with some blasters to kill elite infantry. Each one packs a couple of shots at strength 5, AP 3 and damage 2. Their shooting's okay, particularly against things like standard Space Marines, but perhaps just as importantly, they're quite a cheap, fast-moving infantry unit that can do actions. They're quite a nice choice for getting things like retrieve data done, or the Tower Unique Secondary where they have to do actions on the edges of the board. Otherwise, I think that they're just generally going to be a fairly niche peripheral unit. They've got limited support as auxiliaries, are pretty easy to kill with most anti-infantry weapons, and I feel like a lot of their best utility might be tied to whether or not those action objectives are the ones that are being taken or not. Perhaps they were a bit more relevant in Nakmund when a lot of people were taking retrieve data quite a bit. Still though, an interesting enough unit, and definitely have their advantages, even if they're a tiny bit niche. I'd rank them a 7 out of 10 overall. While we're on fast moving things, let's talk flyers. First up we've got the Razor Shark Strike Fighter. I'd say fairly standard as flyers go for Warhammer 40K. A 155 point model with some reasonable enough generalist firepower with those ion rifles, plus an accelerated burst cannon. Flyers definitely have their advantages and disadvantages. They should be able to get line of sight on what they need to and deliver their damage to the unit that needs to die the most, but they won't be doing much for things like objectives, and perhaps a unit that's usually going to be easy to see and shoot down from most places on the board. The Razor Shark Strike Fighter isn't terrible and say it's usable, but it just seems to be very badly balanced versus the Sunshark Bomber, which is only a little bit more and comes with a lot better gear. I'd rank it a 6 out of 10 overall, not terrible, but just completely outclassed, and seeing as in match play you're now only allowed to run 2 flyers in the list, the Sunshark is going to get the nod more than this. Talking of which, following all the Tau points changes at the start of Nephilim, the Sunshark really took off as being one of the most common units in competitive lists. A 165 point flyer model that's just really quite efficient and does get you really quite a lot of shooting, plus a big mortal wound bomb. At range it strikes with the iron rifles from the interceptor drones, a missile pod, seeker missiles, and also packs a marker light. Perhaps shooting that isn't really all that much worse than the Razor Shark, and seeing as it also offers a mortal wound bomb that's likely to do anything from around 2 to 5 mortal wounds per turn, the Sunshark is just pretty much the clear winner. As mentioned, flyers do have their disadvantages. This thing also has kind of middling durability with its 4+ save, but at the moment it looks like taking a pair of these really isn't a bad choice for most Tau lists. Heavy support next, and first up we have the fearsome Hammerhead with the almighty railgun that ignores the invul saves. A pretty terrifying threat to have on the other side of the table if you are fighting anything that has heavy armor like knights or any vehicles. The Hammerhead also gets its built-in hit reroll with its targeting array, a pretty reasonable chance of hitting its target, and then a very reasonable chance of wounding it if you spare a command point, or if you're playing either Tau Sept or Farside enclaves, getting you to reroll the wound roll. It also has at least some fairly threatening secondary weapons. It can take some accelerated burst cannons or seeker missiles, and it's a fairly fast tank to get line of sight on what it needs to. If you find yourself fighting against hordes rather than against vehicles as well, it can still make itself useful. It does have the option of that submunition stratagem for a fair bunch of mortal wounds against big stacked up infantry units. As for downsides, its durability isn't super standout. Anti-tank weapons will kill this pretty easily without any invul saves or anything. It doesn't get core, so has limited buffs, and even with submunitions it's still going to be a bit more limited if there's no heavy targets about. The railgun is absolutely devastating when the damage goes through, but a fair bunch of rules can make that a lot harder. It won't like transhuman physiology type rules, anything that turns off its rerolls, or anything that can absorb the damage of a single shot. In more recent 9th edition codexes, all of those rules are a bit more common. Still though, having a few in a list is rarely a bad move. Along with things like crisis suits and sunsharks, perhaps some of the best firepower and direct damage dealers that the Tau have at the moment. Otherwise, in the heavy support slots, I'd class the rest of the fire support as usable but not standout. I feel like the Skyray is just kind of fine with its seeker missile rack plus its marker lights. Damage wise against a lot of vehicles, it's not going to be terrible compared with the Hammerhead, though it is a little bit less efficient for the points. It is cheaper than the Hammerhead, it's a bit better if you happen to be fighting against flyers for lists that run those, and the 2 marker lights aren't insignificant either, allowing you to get a few more of those into your army. In general, people just do seem to prefer the Hammerhead overall though to the Skyray. Just the massive punch of being able to kick through invul saves and deal some mortal wounds does seem to stack up as just more useful to more lists than the Seeker missiles. Still though, definitely not a terrible choice. I'd rank it a 7 out of 10. The broadsides were a unit that again were pretty super standout on the Codex drop, being really quite cheap firepower and also having the core keyword for a lot of important buffs. Since then though, they've been quite drastically reined in, losing core and also going up in points. Despite this though, on raw damage and particularly with Markerlight buffs, they're still not awful. The rail rifles plus some plasma rifles all do pretty nicely for anti-tank. They could also take cheap smart missiles instead of the plasma rifles for a bit of ignores line of sight, though admittedly nerfed compared with what it was given the barrage nerf, and they are hard to kill. With being 2+ save infantry with a whole bunch of wounds, they can get light cover quite easily. They've got good support system choices as well, things like being able to move and fire for no penalty, buffs to hit against fly or auto wounds on 6s, and you can also hide drones in the unit for a bit of added durability, maybe things like shield drones, perhaps things like shield drones to tank some high powered shots on. Losing core really was a big deal to them though. It just makes them less efficient damage dealing platforms than the crisis suits that also have better mobility by far. And in the heavy support section, it does seem that the Hammerhead railguns tend to be outcompeting the rail rifles at the moment. Again, kicking through invuls is really good. I also do feel that their high yield missile pods probably don't need to be the extra 10 points over the rail rifles. I feel they're a bit undercosted and wouldn't be run very much at the moment in comparison. Despite the nerfs, I still wouldn't say that broadsides are completely useless. I scored them a 7 out of 10 overall for an interesting enough fire support unit that can hold down an objective, but they're a far cry from being the kings of the Tau gun line that they perhaps were on the Codex drop. Moving on, we've got the Riptide, 240 points base for the biggest battlesuit in the core Codex, a pretty durable fire support option with 14 wounds, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and then some really interesting buffs that it can get from Nova Charge, either choosing extra damage, extra durability, or speed each time it fires it up. It has some okay support in the battlesuit stratagems like -2 to charge and things, plus a reasonable choice of support systems that you can mount on really quite a big suit. Out of its weapons, I far prefer the Ion Accelerator for the big damage 4 anti-tank punch, though even when you're overcharging or Nova-charging it, I'm still just not very convinced that it really adds up to being particularly impressive damage on such a points-intensive unit. I feel like the damage output on this guy maybe just suffers a bit because you're paying for so much durability. Overall, I'd put it in a fairly similar place to the broadside and the Skyray. Perfectly usable Tau fire support, though maybe not top tier. I'd generally be more tempted by crisis suits or hammerheads, though it does seem that at least some people are making them work competitively. There was that Tau army list recently that took a grand tournament down and used 3 of the things. Overall, I'd rank it a 7 out of 10, maybe on the higher end of that though. If I had been feeling generous, I might have put it up to an 8. Lastly, in our selection of OK Tau firepower units that aren't particularly standout, we have the Storm Surge. Again, another very heavy recipient of recent Tau nerfs, going from a really quite attractive 330 points all the way up to a massive 400, and basically being taken far less in Tau list as a result. The model does have quite a lot of things going for it. It's got enormous strength 16 and damage 12 shots with that pulsed blast cannon, and it's particularly strong with the Boar concept, which you can allow it to ignore invul saves with. Another solid option along with railguns for just deleting a unit pretty much no questions asked. Otherwise, it's got a whole bunch of decent extra weapon systems like destroyer missiles and the cluster rocket pods. It's got a fair amount of support systems to keep all those guns firing accurately with, and it can potentially stride towards the enemy without any fear of being locked up due to being a Titanic unit, or potentially do that action to drop its anchors for better shooting if it does make sense that you can stay still. Overall, I'd say the main issue with it is that it's just far less efficient after the huge points rise going all the way up to 400. Again, certainly not unusable for the cost, though it does have some disadvantages from being a Titanic unit. It's got poor interaction with obscuring terrain, and you can't really spam them efficiently in Nephilim without giving up all your command points. Overall, I'd rank it a 6 out of 10 at the moment. Again, not totally unusable, but just a bit less standout than some of the top firepower options. Fortifications next, and we have the Tidewall fortifications, the shield line, drone port, and gun rig. These things are kind of halfway between a fortification and a vehicle, allowing you to embark some strike teams or something and hover them towards the enemy from a place of relative safety. The gun rig also boasts a rail weapon with damage D3+3, and the drone port can dock some tactical drones, potentially unleashing a bit of firepower as it moves up. They're really quite cool bits of Tau moving terrain, though they do have their downsides. The damage is really quite inefficient if they even have any of it. It's quite a lot of investment in trying to make strike teams work, which maybe aren't the strongest units for the Tau at the moment. The defense is merely okay despite being a fortification. It moves with an unusual action mechanic, which maybe isn't ideal. And if you do want to transport some Fire Warriors into battle, then the Devilfish do it pretty well already. Being able to disembark after moving for that stratagem is great. In general, I just wouldn't be particularly tempted to take these outside of fun and fluffy armies, as opposed to in more honed and optimized ones. I'd rank them a 3 out of 10 for strength at the moment. Lastly, for the core codex, we get into the HQ slots, and we'll start with perhaps the most exciting models out of any of them, the Tau Commanders. Perhaps one of the best datasheets in the codex, really good buffs and decent damage dealing, lots of good combos, and they're perhaps so powerful that people are often tempted to take multiple detachments just so they could take more. On the base datasheets, there's 3 different flavours of Commander: the Crisis Commander, Cold Star, and Enforcer. All of them do have a bunch of reasonable things going for them though: a reroll aura of 1s to hit, being solid damage dealers that hit on 2s with all the decent crisis weapons, and can potentially have some shield or marker drones follow them along in tow, both to make them a bit harder to kill and maybe put some marker lights that are character protected on the enemy. Maybe the best thing about them though is the combinations of Warlord traits, relics, and prototype systems that you can use. For Warlord traits, you've got things like rerolling all hits and wounds, a couple of really good damage boosts to nearby crisis units. For relics, you've got things to make them tougher, such as the Begal Hunter's Plate or the dangerous Onager Gauntlet for some combat. And for prototype systems, you've got things like the DW02 Burst Cannon, a very efficient gun for the cost, and there's a few other really quite interesting prototype weapon systems as well. You can make a fun melee build for them as well, say take that Onager Gauntlet, the Thermoneutronic Projector, another prototype system, and the full rerolls, and you can potentially have a Crisis Commander that's both really devastating at shooting and also in combat, pretty unusual for Tau. As for their relative advantages, I feel like the Crisis and the Cold Star are maybe just a bit more attractive than the Enforcer at the moment. The Crisis Commander is the cheapest at only 100 points base, and its buff is pretty nice, ignoring modifiers for nearby Crisis units, and fall back and shoot if you need it. Particularly ignore modifiers is really quite nice. It counters things like dense cover or enemy ones, plus they can be advancing around the board no problems even if they're not in Montcar. The Cold Star Commander is perhaps the more useful one if you want a commander to go out and deal damage. Having a really great movement characteristic is pretty nice. It means that you can get that damage right where it needs to, or jump backwards and retreat to safety if it makes more sense. It also has the high output burst cannon as well, another really efficient spammed damage weapon for the cost, and can support a crisis suit unit to be moving around the board really quite quickly as well. The Enforcer Commander I'd still say is usable, but maybe perhaps the weakest of the 3. 120 points gets you a fair bit more durability with a 2+ save built in, and his boost is to give out objective secure to crisis suit units. Still really not a bad boost, but given the extra points, I'd say maybe you're better off with one of the other 2. For downsides for commanders in general, maybe one of the biggest weaknesses is only being able to take 1 detachment, meaning that you might need to take multiple patrols and pay more CP for the privilege. It is one advantage of running Farsight enclaves, which mean that you can take multiple commanders per detachment. Even with durability relics and things, they're perhaps not super tough if they get exposed to enemy firepower. Generally they need to play quite cagey, hiding behind your own units or using terrain. They're a pretty valuable unit if you lose them. Overall though, a really efficient Tau datasheet, lots of list run multiples, and there's lots of good combos. I'd rank them a 10 out of 10 overall for Tau. On a pretty similar level, we also have Commander Shadowsun herself, a unique commander datasheet that's actually really quite easy to field. She can be taken in a Supreme Command detachment, which means that you can get around the multiple commander limit if she's around. I'd say by far the biggest reason to take her is getting 4 rerolls for 1 core Tau unit. Applying that to a big blob of 5 battlesuits is just a really efficient boost, and you can barely go too far wrong with that. Otherwise, for positives, she comes with a pair of fusion blasters for some close range anti-tank. She has some of the standard things that commanders bring, like the rerolls, and is a bit harder to take out than you might expect for the stat line with the stealth field and the attached drones. Even her redeployment warlord trait isn't terrible with the Master of Kauyon. If you are taking Kauyon, you get to redeploy multiple units, which is quite nice. And it's quite nice in Nephilim that you don't even have to pay the command point to take that one if you don't want to. As for downsides, I'd say perhaps the main disadvantage is that she's lower damage than other commanders. Most commanders can have 3 or 4 weapons, whereas she can only have the 2. She's generally a bit more optimal in Tau Sept than other places, and she doesn't get her own free choice of other relics, warlord traits, or prototype systems that you might want to take. Still though, a really solid competitive choice. I'd rank a 9 out of 10 for in-game power. Next up we have the Commander of the Enclaves in Commander Farsight. He's an HQ choice for 130 points as a unique character, and I feel it's a pretty reasonable include in the Farsight Enclaves list if you didn't need the commander slot for something else. He gets the nice Crisis Commander buffs, falling back and shooting, plus ignoring modifiers, plus the rerolls that standard commanders get. He gives a unit +1 to hit in melee, and plus is actually a very credible threat in combat himself with that damage 3 Dawn Blade. He also comes with Exemplar of Monkar as a good warlord trait as well, so you don't have to feel too bad about taking him as your warlord. As for downsides, he is locked to Farsight Enclaves, so you're not taking him outside that. He does have less firepower compared with most commanders, despite having 2 shots on that plasma rifle, and again doesn't get his flexible choice worth of other warlord traits, relics and things if you'd want it. Overall, I wouldn't say it's mandatory or auto-include or anything, though I wouldn't say it's a bad choice either. I'd rank him an 8 out of 10 overall. Moving on, we have the Ethereals, the Ethereal Ornvar and Ornshi, 80 points, 100 points, and 105 respectively. In general, the invocations that these guys choose to pick up tend to be the same ones. The 5+ Feel No Pain is awesome on a Crisis Suit unit. Farming a command point a turn, usually on a 2+, is great as well. And perhaps if you did want to pick up a third one, then the Zephyr's Grace one is quite nice to double down on durability, if that makes sense, more than taking out command points. If you're running the standard one, I pretty much always pick up the Humble Stave relic to make the invocations go off reliably and get 2 of them. It basically doubles the value of the character in that way, and I will be quite tempted to take a hover drone as well. That way you can follow around with Crisis Suit units and still get the buffs off. It can be a reasonable place to take marker drones as well, a safe character protected just behind the lines and mark targets for the guns to kill. Otherwise, Ornshi and Ornvar both pay more points than the standard one, but you do get those 2 reliable invocations without having to shell out a command point for a relic, which is quite nice. Ornshi gets a little bit of melee, and Ornvar is harder to kill with his guards and the paradox of duality, though those 2 do have the trade-off of the extra points and being locked to specific seps. Obviously in themselves, besides Ornshi in combat, they really don't do all that much in terms of damage, and you can't take them in Farsight Enclaves. You have the trade-off of giving up on Ethereals for more commanders. Overall though, a very solid support choice despite going up in points a bit. I'd rank them a 9 out of 10, a pretty reasonable choice to be following along with Crisis Suits. Next up we've got the Cardiff Fireblade, the Fire Warrior support unit, a 50-point character with a damage 2 pulse rifle, plus a couple of different buffs that help out the Fire Warriors, exploding 6s to hit, and some reroll 1s. It's really quite a cheap character, and again he can take some marker drones if it makes sense to. Overall, as a support character, I think he's kind of fine. He is just kind of dependent on Strike and Breacher teams being some of the primary damage dealers to be good though, and at the moment they just really aren't compared with the battle suits. It's even maybe a bit of a struggle to take with Breacher teams as well, as they'll often want to be piling out of Devilfish, so you won't be able to get both buffs on them, as one of them is declared in the command phase. If he does get exposed or sniped, then he doesn't have much defense to speak of, and he is competing with really quite good HQs between Crisis Commanders, Ethereals, and maybe some unique special characters, and overall it just adds up to him not being taken very much at all in competitive lists. Overall, as a buffing character, I think it's really not too bad. If Fire Warriors were scary, then he'd be very good, but at the moment they aren't, so he's taken very rarely. I'd rank him a 7 out of 10 overall. Next up, we've got the Kroot Shaper at 25 points, pretty impressively cheap for a character, and isn't going to fight for detachment slots as he can be taken slot free if carnivores are present in a list. For the cost, what he brings to the table I think is at least fairly impressive. He does have fairly reasonable combat stats for a character of that level. He gives Kroot units better leadership and reroll 1s to hit, and he could maybe be an interesting character for being an expendable one to bear relics and things. I've seen a couple of lists that use him to use the EM Scrambler to deny deep strike on objectives and debuff enemy units of auras. Again, despite being for 25 points, I think pretty reasonable. He's really not going to be taken all that much, because in general you don't really want to be buffing Kroot as primary damage dealers. They're quite happy just being expendable screening units, and in general aren't going to be doing much besides bullying light infantry anyway. For that reason, even at a really cheap cost like 25 points, he just feels like a bit of a luxury pick, but I feel like taking one in a list really isn't going to hold you back too much. A 25-point annoying character is kind of fine. If he manages to buff some damage or kill something himself, then so much the better. Overall, I've ranked him a 7 out of 10. Not a particularly common pick, but not unusable. Next up, we've got Dark Strider, a Tau Sept character for 60 points. Really quite a cheap HQ choice, and perhaps the main reason to bring him along is giving +1 to wound for 1 core unit against 1 marked target. As shooting buffs go, it's really quite an easy one to use. Just literally mark a crisis suit unit and mark the unit that they're shooting at, and then get a massive extra damage boost from their guns. Otherwise, he can chip in with a little bit of damage himself, a marker light, or that shade pulse carbine that he gets. He can allow fallback and shoot for non-battle suit units, and he gets a pre-game move like Pathfinders. Again, he's perhaps a unit that would be a bit better if strike teams and breacher teams were a little bit more efficient. He is locked to the Tau Sept, and is competing with very good HQs again, Ethereals, Commanders, and potentially Long Strike as you're playing Tau if you're taking him. Overall though, I do think he's pretty usable. I've chosen to rate him an 8 out of 10 here. Lastly, for units out of the main codex, we have Long Strike, an 160 point Tau Sept character, and if you've got an HQ slot free and you are running Hammerheads, then it pretty much makes sense to upgrade to him for the first one that you're taking. It's really not all that much more than regular Hammerheads at plus 15 points, and just getting a Ballistic Skill 3+ on that scary railgun and secondary weapons is pretty good in itself. I'd say that alone is probably worth the upgrade, but on top of that he also gets a +1 to wound against vehicles and monsters. He'll be able to reroll a hit roll and a wound roll with that railgun, seeing as he's Tau Sept, and he also gets to buff 1 Hammerhead nearby as well. It makes its shooting count as having a marker light for another 3+ to hit. It also perhaps makes more sense to upgrade his secondary weapons to be something like Smart Missiles or Accelerator Burst Cannon rather than leaving them cheap, as at least he'll be hitting with them pretty accurately. Overall, I think he's a really quite solid unit. I've chosen to rank him a 9 out of 10. In terms of weaknesses, he is locked to Tau Sept. He isn't particularly hard to take out, no harder than a standard Hammerhead, and anything that counters railguns will generally cause him issues as well. Transhuman physiology, negating damage, or things that turn off rerolls. Finally, I thought I'd just very briefly touch on the Forge World units, which rather unfortunately for the Tower right now can basically be summed up in one line, generally really quite underwhelming. Some factions have plenty of usable Forge World datasheets, but currently it just seems that Tau aren't really one of them. Maybe out of some of the most interesting picks for them are the Tetras, fairly cheap expendable 40-point vehicles that can fire off some marker lights, and maybe be expendable things to park on objectives and cause the enemy to have to deal with them. Also potentially interesting are the Remora drones, interesting fast mover units that can do some precision strikes on enemy units or maybe help out with secondaries. Though being a flyer unit, they really are competing for slots with the Sun Sharks, which are really quite a competitive staple at the moment. Otherwise, besides those, I'd say most of the rest are even more underwhelming. The hazard suits have okay damage, but don't have the crisis keyword to get locked out of a whole bunch of buffs. The other flyers just pretty much seem inferior to the Sun Sharks. The Ravana and the Yavara are both overcosted, and you're better off with Riptides right now in my opinion. The Supremacy armor was kind of interesting when you could shield it in a whole bunch of shield drones and basically make it invincible. At the moment though, for 1000 points it's just far too easy to take out, and it's kind of prohibitively expensive for most lists in the first place. Finally, Overlie is an interesting enough crisis commander. It's only 100 points, which isn't bad seeing as that includes weapons, but for the most part with commanders being so good, you don't really want to spend one of your commander slots on him rather than something else. I feel like you could easily reduce the cost of pretty much most of these on the list, and you probably wouldn't cause too many problems and make them a bit more usable. At the moment, I'd probably just be sticking to the Tower Empire Codex units though, unless you just want to run these for fun or lore purposes. In any case, with that said, I think that just about brings us to the end of a quick look through just about every unit in the Tower Empire Codex. As always, let me know what you think below. I'm sure I've missed some interesting features of plenty of the units. As always, if I made any errors, then please let me know down in the comments below, or if I have missed anything that is a particular strength or weakness that might make you pick a unit or not. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'll be trying to get one of these videos made for every faction in the game, plus I'm sure there'll be more for the Tower Empire in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's what allows me to keep on making big long videos like this that take an awful lot of time and effort to make. If you are enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.